Some things in this world don't make sense until years later, when you're sitting by a window somewhere quiet, and the whole shape of a life finally comes into view. This is one of those stories, and we think, once you've heard it, you'll understand why we couldn't let it go unspoken. Her name was Callie Marsh. She was 22 years old the morning she walked out of her uncle's house in Harlan County, Kentucky. With a canvas satchel on one shoulder and a wood-handled drawknife tucked under her arm like a rifle. The drawknife had belonged to her teacher, a chairmaker named Holt Greer, who had spent 31 years teaching people in that county that would, if you listened to it right, would tell you exactly what it wanted to become. Callie had been his apprentice for 4 years. She had also, in a way most people in Harlan County quietly understood, been the closest thing he had to a daughter. When Holt died the previous autumn, he left her the drawknife, his shave horse, and a note that said, simply, "You already know what I taught you. Go somewhere that needs it." She had stayed longer than she should have. That was the truth she admitted to herself as she crossed the county line that May morning with $43 in her coat pocket and nowhere particular to go. Her uncle, Gerald Marsh, a quiet man made bitter by years of bad timber contracts and a wife who'd left him, had tolerated her presence through the winter out of some thin obligation to his dead sister's memory. By spring that obligation had run dry. He told her she had until the end of April. She stayed 3 extra weeks because she didn't know where to go. Then he changed the lock. You might wonder what a 22-year-old woman does when the last door closes behind her. When there's no parents to call, no savings worth speaking of, no plan past the next meal. Some people freeze, some people fall. Callie Marsh did something else. She walked to the bus station, bought a ticket to the smallest town on the departures board that she didn't recognize, and got on. The town was called Sewell's Ford. It sat in the eastern edge of Virginia's coalfield country, tucked into a bend in the Clinch River like something the mountains had forgotten to swallow. Population 800 and something. 1 diner, 1 hardware store, 1 church with a leaning steeple that the congregation had been promising to fix for 11 years. Callie arrived at 3:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday. She ate a bowl of soup at the diner, counted her money twice, and asked the woman behind the counter, a broad-shouldered woman named Lottie, who had clearly heard every variation of a hard-luck story that 2 legs and a bus ticket could produce, whether there was anywhere in town a person might find temporary work. Lottie looked at the drawknife. Then she looked at Callie's hands. She said, "You do finish work. Furniture?" Callie said she did. Lottie said, "Go see Emmett Vale on Sycamore Street. He's got a mill shop. Lost his sander last month and he's behind on orders." Callie found Emmett Vale's shop before sundown. It was a low clapboard building, with sawdust packed into every crack of its foundation, and the smell of pine resin so thick in the air that breathing it felt like eating. Emmett himself was a man in his late 60s, heavy through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same lumber he worked. He hired her on the spot. Not out of charity, he made clear, but because he had 12 chairs ordered for a church in Roanoke, and he needed someone who could work fast and clean. She slept her first 2 nights in Sewell's Ford in the back of Emmett's shop, on a folding cot between 2 sawhorses, covered by a horse blanket. She did not complain. She had slept worse. By the end of her first week, Emmett Vale had raised her wage by 50 cents an hour without her asking. He wasn't the kind of man who explained himself, but she understood. Her work spoke clearly. Holt Greer had made sure of that. It was during that first week that she first heard about the Aldford place. Emmett mentioned it sideways, the way people in small towns mention things they've talked about so long the words have worn smooth. He was planing a tabletop, and she was pulling a chair leg through the shave horse when he said, without looking up, "You know, if you're planning to stay, there's a property on the other side of the Mill Creek that's been sitting empty. 11 years. Belongs to the county now for back taxes. Old wheelwright's property, shop, house attached. People say it's too far gone to save." "What do people say who aren't people?" Callie asked. Emmett almost smiled. "I say it's got good bones. But I'm 70 years old, and I'm not the one who'd have to prove it." She asked the county clerk about it the following Monday. The clerk, a thin, precise man named Sutton who wore his reading glasses on a neck chain, pulled a folder from a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been touched since the previous administration, and slid it across the desk without ceremony. The property had been in tax default since 2011. The back amount, with penalties, was $412. The county had been trying to sell it for years. No one had made a serious offer. The main objection, as far as Sutton could gather, was that the shop roof had collapsed at one end. and the house had a crack in its foundation, the width of a man's palm. Callie had $31 left to her name at that point, after food and 2 weeks of rent at a rooming house on the edge of town. She asked Sutton if there was any provision for a work-in-lieu arrangement. He looked at her over his glasses chain. She explained. She would bring the property up to county code over a period of 12 months. In exchange, the county would forgive the tax debt and transfer the deed. She had trade skills. She had references. She could start immediately. Sutton said he'd have to bring it to the county commissioner. She said she'd wait. She waited 40 minutes in a plastic chair in the hallway of the county clerk's office while Sutton made 2 phone calls behind a frosted glass door. When he came back, he said, "Commissioner says he'll accept a partial cash payment of $80 and a written work agreement for the structural repairs. 12-month term. You default, the property reverts." Callie paid the $80 in cash. It left her with $11. She signed her name on the agreement in Sutton's careful ink. She owned a property, the Aldford Place, named for the family who'd built it in 1889, the last of whom had died without heirs in the 1990s. Was, in the most honest description available, a ruin with potential. The wheelwright's shop attached to the house had once been the second best in the county, according to Emmett, who had taken his father's wagon wheels there as a boy. The house itself was 2 stories, 4 rooms, with a parlor fireplace that had been boarded over and a staircase that creaked but held. The collapsed section of the shop roof had let in enough weather over 11 years to rot the north wall from the bottom up. The foundation crack in the house had not spread further, which Callie's borrowed knowledge of old construction told her was actually a good sign. Cracks that stabilize are not cracks that kill a building. It was the moving ones you had to fear. She moved in the same week she signed the papers. She had no furniture. She slept on the floor of the parlor, with her canvas satchel as a pillow, and the draw knife lying next to her like a companion. The first night, rain came in through a gap in the upstairs dormer, and she lay in the dark listening to it tap against the wood floors above her, and she thought, "This is mine, even this." She worked Emmett's shop by day, and worked the Aldford Place every evening and on weekends. Emmett, without making a production of it, began to let her take offcuts and rejected lumber home in her barrow. He never called it a gift. He said she was clearing space in his shop. She accepted this fiction gratefully. The town noticed her, in the way small towns notice anyone who appears without explanation and then starts to work too hard. People drove slowly past the Aldford Place to look. The owner of the hardware store, a forthright woman named Bea Callum, started setting aside salvaged nails and hinge hardware with a handwritten tag that said Marsh clipped to the bag. When Callie tried to pay, Bea waved her off and said she was making space on her shelves. The fiction was becoming a habit. By midsummer, she had rebuilt the north wall of the shop. It took her 3 months and more hours than she could count, working by battery lantern when the evening light failed. She learned things during those months that Holt Greer had never had occasion to teach her: stone foundation work, timber framing, the particular stubbornness of 100-year-old mortise joints. She learned by doing it wrong first, by pulling apart what she'd built and trying again. Her hands changed. They were already a craftsperson's hands, but now they became something else. The hands of someone who had built a wall and known the wall might be the only thing standing between her and nothing. She did not talk about her uncle. She did not talk about the bus. When people in Sewell's Ford asked where she'd come from, she said Harlan County. And they nodded, and that was usually enough. What she did talk about, when she talked, was Holt Greer. She talked about him, the way people talk about someone who is not gone so much as relocated, present, in technique, in habit, in the particular angle at which she held the draw knife against a piece of ash. She had learned from him that every piece of wood has a story written in its grain, and that a good craftsperson's job is to read that story before they start cutting. She had learned that patience in craft was not separate from patience in life. She had learned, and this was the thing she didn't say out loud, but carried like ballast, that a person could be taught to stay, if the right person did the teaching. It was in October, in the 3rd month after she moved in, that she found the room. She'd been pulling up the parlor floorboards to check for rot beneath the joists. The boards were old-growth pine, dense and dark with a century of foot traffic, and she was working methodically from the east wall inward when the 4th board from the corner came up, not with the resistance she expected, but with a hollow sound, and she found not a joist beneath it but a space, a shallow recess, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, lined with oilcloth so old it had turned the color of tobacco. Inside the recess was a tin box, She set it on the floor and looked at it for a long time before she opened it. She didn't know why exactly. Perhaps because she understood, at some level, that whatever was inside the box had been hidden by someone who wanted it, found only by the right person. Or perhaps because finding something hidden in the floor of your house, alone in October, in a town where you knew almost no one, makes you go carefully. The box contained 3 things. The first was a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, 22 of them, addressed in a close, careful hand to someone named Adelaide Morse, at an address in Bristol, Tennessee. None of them bore a return address. None of them had been opened. The second was a leather-covered account ledger, its pages dense with figures written in pencil, covering what appeared to be the years 1921 through 1934. The third was a folded piece of paper, separate from the rest, written in a different hand, hurried, slanting, as though the writer had been in a hurry or in distress. It said, "These were hers. I should have sent them. I didn't know how. If you're reading this, the house found someone. Please find her too." There was no signature. Callie sat on the parlor floor with those 3 things arranged around her in the lantern light and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off the bus in Sewell's Ford. The particular stillness of knowing that something is about to matter. She did not open the letters that night. She put everything back in the tin box and put the tin box on the shelf above the parlor fireplace, where she could see it while she worked. She asked about Adelaide Morse the next day, carefully, in the way you ask about something when you're not sure what you might uncover. She asked Emmett first. He went quiet for a moment, then said that the name sounded like it might belong to the family that had held the Aldford land before the last wheelwright. The generation before the generation he remembered. He thought his mother might have known something. His mother had been dead for 20 years. She asked Bea Callum. Bea put down the hinge hardware she was sorting and said, "Adelaide Morse, Lord. My grandmother talked about her. She was a seamstress, did finish work on wedding dresses mostly, lived in that house from girlhood until..." Bea paused. "Until she didn't anymore. I always heard she left under some kind of cloud. Nobody said what exactly." She asked the librarian, a young man named Forrest, who had apparently made it his quiet project to digitize every scrap of local history in Sewell's Ford. He found Adelaide Morse in 20 minutes. Born 1899 in Russell County. Appeared in the 1920 census at the Aldford address. Appeared in the 1930 census at the same address. By 1940 she was gone, with no forwarding trace in any record he could find. There was, however, a brief notice in the Russell County Gazette from 1934. Not an obituary, just a social column item, the kind that noted comings and goings as a matter of small-town record-keeping. It said that Miss Adelaide Morse, formerly of Sewell's Ford, had departed for Bristol, Tennessee, to take a position with a textile concern. She had left. But the letters meant for her in Bristol had never been sent. They'd been hidden in the floor of the house she'd lived in. It took Callie another 2 weeks to untangle it. With Forrest's help and a phone call to a historical archive in Bristol that took 4 days to return. What emerged was this. Adelaide Morse had left Sewell's Ford in 1934 under circumstances that the historical record was tactful about, but not entirely silent on. The textile position in Bristol had been arranged, it appeared, by a brother-in-law who wished her gone from the county. Adelaide Morse had been keeping the accounts for the Aldford wheelwright operation. The ledger in the tin box confirmed this, 12 years of careful figures. And she had discovered, somewhere in those figures, evidence of money being moved in ways that would have been very inconvenient for several people in Sewell's Ford if they became known. She had said nothing. She had simply been sent away. And the letters written to her at the Bristol address, by whom and about what, the return address is absent, had never reached her because someone in this house had intercepted them and hidden them beneath the parlor floor instead of burning them. Whether that someone had been protecting Adelaide or punishing her, the note left behind didn't say. If you're reading this, the house found someone. Please find her too. Callie opened the letters in early November, sitting at the workbench she'd built in the shop by then, with Emmett's permission and his old magnifying glass. They were love letters, 22 of them, written over a period of 9 months by a man named Thomas Aldford, the youngest son of the wheelwright family, who had died in a farming accident in 1936, 2 years after Adelaide left. They were not dramatic letters. They were, in their way, more heartbreaking than drama. Careful letters, steady letters, the letters of a man who did not know he was writing to a woman who would never read them. He wrote about the work, about the sound of the river in September, About a quilt her mother had left behind that he had kept folded on the chair by the window because it smelled like cedar and he couldn't bring himself to move it. He had not known she was gone. He had thought she was choosing not to reply. She tried to find out what had become of Adelaide Morse after Bristol. She didn't have to try very hard. Forrest found her in a 1942 marriage record in Bristol. She had married a man named John Hartwell. She had died in 1979 in Kingsport, Tennessee at the age of 80. She had, as far as Forrest could tell, lived a quiet and apparently decent life. She had never come back to Sewell's Ford. What she had never known, that the letters existed. That Thomas Aldford had written them. That someone had hidden them in the floor of the house she'd left, perhaps out of a failed intention to forward them. Perhaps out of something less admirable. What she had carried away from Sewell's Ford, as far as the record showed, was the belief that she'd been sent away and not looked for. Callie thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while she worked the planer in Emmett's shop. She thought about it while she mortared the last section of foundation crack in late November, on her knees in the cold mud, packing the repair mixture into the gap with a margin trowel. She thought about it while she sat by the parlor fireplace on the first evening she lit it, the chimney having been cleaned and repaired over the course of 3 weekends, and watched the room take on the particular warm gravity that only a fire can give a place. The house had been waiting. Not in any mystical sense, but in the way that things left undone wait. The ledger unclosed, the letters unsent, the note folded in with them like a quiet instruction. Someone had known, perhaps, that the house wasn't finished yet, that it still had something to give. By the end of March, 10 months after she'd stepped off a bus in Sewell's Ford with $11 and a draw knife, the Aldford property was structurally sound. The county inspector came on a Tuesday, walked through both floors, made notes on his clipboard, and signed off on every item of the work agreement, without a single objection. Sutton, when she came back to the clerk's office, processed the deed transfer in 20 minutes. He shook her hand over the counter, which she understood, from the economy of the gesture, was a significant event for him. The deed had her name on it, Callie Marsh. The property at the old Aldford lot, Sewell's Ford, Russell County, Virginia. She stood outside the clerk's office afterward in the thin spring light, and held the paper copy in both hands, and did not cry. She was not, by nature or by practice, a person given to tears in public, but she stood there for a long time. Long enough that Bea Callum, who was crossing the street on her way back from the post office, stopped and said, "Good news, I take it." Callie said, "I think so." Bea said, "Good, we were rooting for you." She didn't say who we was. She didn't need to. There was one more thing Callie did in the spring that she has not talked about much. She wrote a letter to a woman in Kingsport, Tennessee, Adelaide Morse Hartwell's daughter, whose name Forrest had found in the 1979 obituary. She explained who she was, that she lived now in the house on the old Aldford lot, that she had found something during restoration work that she believed belonged to the Morse family's history. She did not say love letters. She said correspondence and documents that predated Adelaide's departure, and that she thought the family might want to know they existed. The daughter, a woman in her 70s, it turned out, called her on a Sunday afternoon in April. The conversation lasted an hour and 40 minutes. The daughter had known that her mother had left Sewell's Ford under unhappy circumstances. She had not known about Thomas Aldford. She had not known about the letters. She was quiet for a very long time after Callie explained. Then she said, "My mother used to say that the worst thing about leaving a place isn't what you lose. It's not knowing whether it knew you were gone." Callie looked around her parlor, at the rebuilt walls, at the fireplace, at the draw knife hanging on a nail above the workbench door, where she could see it from almost every room. "I think it knew," she said. "We've told you this story because we believe it asks something of you. Something quiet and specific, not a grand question. Just this: is there a place in your life, a thing you walked away from, or were pushed out of, or never quite made yours, that has been waiting without your knowing it? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear."